Cyclops may not seem like a great character to those whose only reference point is the Fox films. In those cinematic adaptations, he was drastically reduced to a simple supporting role, often sidelined in favor of other, more charismatic or popular characters. On top of that, his arc was marked by questionable choices, being betrayed by Jean Grey with Hugh Jackman's Wolverine and later being killed off-screen abruptly due to behind-the-scenes conflicts involving actor James Marsden and director Bryan Singer. However, X-Men 97 begins to recover something comic book readers have known for decades, but that the movies almost completely ignored. In the comics, especially since the X-Factor era, Cyclops has always been portrayed as the unquestioned leader of the team, someone who bears the weight of decisions and their consequences. He doesn't lead through charisma, but through competence, discipline, and strategic vision. Cyclops represents the true balance point between the philosophies of Charles Xavier and Magneto, not only on an ideological level as he tries to reconcile coexistence and survival, but also in the practical day-to-day strategy of the X-Men. He is the one who turns ideals into concrete action, keeping the group together even in the most extreme situations. That is exactly the kind of complexity that X-Men 97 is finally beginning to explore with the depth the character has always deserved. Scott Summers possesses an exceptionally sharp tactical mind, carries an almost absurd level of responsibility on his shoulders, and above all is easily one of the darkest and most complex X-Men of all time. He is not just a symbol of leadership, but a character shaped by hard decisions, always walking a fine line between absolute heroism or a definitive fall into villainy. Cyclops was the first X-Man recruited by Professor Charles Xavier, still very young, when his powers could barely be understood or controlled. While other mutants had the chance to live relatively normal childhoods before discovering who they truly were, Scott's life was brutally interrupted by a trauma that completely redefined his destiny. From that moment on, there was no room for ordinary choices. From then on, Scott Summers' life became almost entirely dedicated to training, not just to fight ever-growing threats, but to learn how to lead people who were as powerful as they were unstable. He was shaped to think several steps ahead, to shoulder the weight of decisions, and very often to carry the guilt that came with them. Stan Lee publicly stated that Cyclops was one of his favorite characters. And the reason is simple. He always had a fondness for tormented heroes, those who suffer in silence. Cyclops fits that archetype perfectly, living in constant conflict due to his inability to fully control his own powers, relying on a visor so he doesn't become a threat to others. At the beginning of his journey with the X-Men, Scott appears as a rigid rule follower, almost a Captain America figure within the group, someone who believes blindly in discipline and hierarchy. Over time, however, that rigidity turns into pragmatism. And when it comes to physical abilities, he may not possess Steve Rogers' raw strength, but he comes very close to peak human conditioning, combined with a level of tactical intelligence that places him among the greatest strategists in the Marvel Universe. After all, Cyclops doesn't exist to be the X-Men's friend, nor to please or win sympathy within the group. He exists, above all, to lead them, and it is precisely this role that causes discomfort for part of the audience, who end up labeling the character as boring, almost like an overly by-the-book Boy Scout, always trying to do everything the right way. But the truth is far simpler and harsher than it seems. If he doesn't act that way, the team literally falls apart. The X-Men are not a normal group. They are extremely powerful individuals, emotionally unstable and often driven by deep trauma. Without firm leadership, chaos sets in quickly. Unlike Professor Xavier, who fulfills a more intellectual and philosophical role, Cyclops is the field leader. He is the man on the front lines, the strategist who makes split-second decisions in the heat of battle, when there is no room for doubt or idealistic speeches. It is Scott Summers who turns theory into action. And if he fails, mutants die. Plain and simple. That responsibility rests entirely on his shoulders, and he knows it better than anyone. It is a massive, constant pressure that allows for no relaxation and no moments of carelessness. That's why, most of the time, Scott is serious, focused, and visibly burdened. Not because he is cold or emotionless, but because he understands the weight of every choice he makes. Cyclops' role was never to look powerful at all times, much less to be the team's charismatic figure. His true role is to ensure that every member of the X-Men delivers their best, on and off the battlefield, even if it costs him his own peace. A perfect moment that encapsulates all of this happens in X-Men 97, during the fight inside the Hell's Cape created by Madeline Pryor. In that sequence, Cyclops literally carries Bishop in his arms so he can exorcise the demons using his energy blasts. The scene isn't there just for visual spectacle. It makes it clear that Scott Summers is always thinking about the team as a whole, using positioning and each member's abilities in the most efficient way possible. And there is no such thing as a great leader without intelligence. Much like Batman, who is famous for always having contingency plans for every possible scenario, more recent stories have begun to explore a lesser-discussed aspect of Cyclops: the fact that he also has backup plans for almost everything. Scott doesn't enter combat relying solely on strength or improvisation. Every move is calculated. There is even formal documentation prepared for extreme scenarios, such as the emergence of a kaiju, a giant monster far beyond any conventional threat. If something of that scale were to appear and the X-Men had to face it, the team already has established protocols and pre-planned strategies. Nothing is left to improvisation when Scott Summers is in command. This strategic mindset connects directly to the true nature of Cyclops' powers. Contrary to what the movies portrayed for years, his optic blasts are not simple heat lasers. They are concussive beams, essentially punches made of pure energy, capable of launching, crushing, and obliterating whatever stands in their path. In practical terms, Scott Summers is someone who can shatter people with a single glance. That's why the level of control he must maintain is extreme and constant. One single mistake, one poorly calculated reflex, and he could devastate an entire area in a matter of seconds. When you combine that destructive potential with his strategic brilliance and near-surgical control over his powers, the conclusion is clear: Cyclops is practically a weapon given human form. The comics themselves have played with this level of precision, showing unlikely scenarios in which Scott uses his powers for seemingly mundane tasks, like playing pool, landing shots with millimeter-level accuracy. But it's important to make one thing very clear: Cyclops is not an Omega-level mutant. What makes him indispensable and so relevant to any team isn't a label of absolute power, but the sum of his abilities, his extreme discipline, his combat proficiency, and, above all, his unmatched capacity for leadership. Scott Summers' deeply traumatic origin weighs heavily on the man Cyclops became over the years. As a child, he and his younger brother, Alex Summers, witnessed the apparent murder of their parents, an event directly involving the Shi'ar Empire, a powerful alien civilization that plays a recurring and pivotal role in X-Men lore. That moment didn't just destroy his childhood. It shaped his worldview at a very early age. After that tragedy, Scott eventually fell into the hands of Mr. Sinister, living in a kind of orphanage secretly controlled by the villain, who saw the Summers brothers as key pieces in his genetic experiments and long-term schemes. This period further deepened Scott's emotional isolation until he was finally rescued by Professor Xavier, who offered him not just shelter, but a purpose. All of these events help explain why Cyclops became so deeply tied to the X-Men, almost as if the team were his only true family. For a long time, he embodied what most people imagine when they think of a classic hero: the exemplary figure, the perfect soldier, the disciplined leader who faithfully believes in Xavier's ideals. But Scott Summers did not remain that way forever. As the years passed, the comics evolved and allowed their characters to mature, and Scott was transformed in a radical way, to the point that, at one stage, he was seen by many readers and even by other heroes in the Marvel Universe as a villain. This shift didn't happen abruptly, but as the result of hard choices piling up over time. A useful way to understand this transformation is to compare him to Captain America. While Steve Rogers always tries to do what is morally right, even when the entire world disagrees with him, Cyclops learned to do what he believed was necessary for the survival of mutantkind, even when those decisions were morally wrong in his own eyes. You might even think, doesn't that sound a lot like Magneto? And yes, it does. But there is a crucial difference. Magneto has always been a symbol and an ideal, while Scott Summers was, in practice, a battlefield leader. Someone who carried real decisions, real lives, and real consequences on his shoulders in a way that Magneto, no matter how powerful, never truly had to face in the same way. Despite being the first X-Man, Cyclops was never truly Professor Xavier's favorite. That place always belonged to Jean Grey, someone in whom Xavier invested not only trust, but far greater expectations. Throughout many stories, it becomes clear that Charles Xavier used Cyclops and the other X-Men as pieces on a much larger chessboard, serving his own beliefs and long-term goals, often ignoring the emotional and psychological toll this took on the team. As Xavier gradually distanced himself, Scott Summers began to see that hypocrisy more clearly. The mentor he once admired no longer seemed infallible, and decisions made for the greater good started to feel increasingly questionable. This disillusionment grew slowly, piling up frustrations and resentment until it reached a definitive breaking point. One that leads directly into the events of Avengers vs. X-Men. This is where we enter one of the most important, complex, and controversial periods in X-Men comic history. During this phase, the mutant situation was utterly desperate. After the events of House of M, the mutant species was literally on the brink of extinction. The Scarlet Witch, who at the time was still considered a mutant, uttered the devastating words that would echo for years: "No more mutants." The result was simple, brutal, and seemingly irreversible. No new mutants were being born. An entire race that had always lived under threat now faced something even worse than prejudice and persecution: slow, inevitable extinction. And it is within this extreme scenario that Scott Summers' choices stop being merely questionable and become necessary. It was then revealed that the Phoenix Force was returning to Earth, a cosmic event capable of completely reshaping the planet's fate. Led by Cyclops, the X-Men did not see its arrival as an immediate threat, but as a real opportunity, perhaps the last chance, to restore the mutant race which was rapidly heading toward extinction. To Scott Summers, the Phoenix represented hope, survival, and the possibility of a future. The Avengers, however, saw the situation in a completely different light. To them, the Phoenix Force was an unpredictable global threat, something that had already caused destruction on an unimaginable scale in the past. Convinced they could not take that risk, they decided to stop its arrival at any cost. To do so, they adopted an extreme measure, attempting to take Hope Summers into custody, the young mutant who was drawing the Phoenix Force to Earth and who symbolized, at the same time, the future of the mutant species. In the end, the X-Men, and Cyclops in particular, managed to protect Hope. Against all expectations, the Phoenix Force did reach Earth, but not in the way anyone anticipated. Instead of possessing a single host, the cosmic entity fractured and split among several mutants, including Scott Summers himself, who came to wield an immeasurable share of that power. What should have been a great victory, one capable of marking the rebirth of mutantkind, took a tragic and deeply disturbing turn. Professor Xavier's return did not come as a gesture of support or reconciliation. On the contrary, he came back to downplay Cyclops' efforts, question his decisions, publicly humiliate him, and openly declare his deep disappointment in the man who had once been his most loyal student. This time, Scott Summers couldn't endure it. The accumulated weight of years of manipulation, pressure, loss, and responsibility finally became unbearable. Consumed by the Phoenix Force and emotionally shattered, he crossed an irreversible line. And it was there, in that decisive moment, that Cyclops killed Professor Xavier, not as a simple villain in the making, but as the tragic outcome of a leader who did everything he could to save his people, only to become the greatest symbol of their fall. This arc became a kind of dark Phoenix story, but with one crucial and deeply ironic difference. Unlike the absolute tragedy experienced by Jean Grey in the past, the power of the Phoenix Force, once it dissipated from Cyclops, was actually able to restore the mutant race. The mutant gene began to manifest again. New children were born with powers, and the extinction that once seemed inevitable was finally averted. In other words, despite all the destruction, the irreparable losses, and the immense moral cost, the plan worked. Scott Summers did exactly what he set out to do. He saved his species. And that creates one of the most fascinating ethical dilemmas in comic book history. How far can a leader go when the end truly justifies the means? This period went on to become one of the best and most defining stories ever written for Cyclops. In it, he not only cements himself as one of the greatest X-Men of all time, but also definitively crosses the line and transforms into one of the most complex and well-crafted villains Marvel has ever produced. A villain who does not act out of ego, hatred, or a thirst for power, but out of conviction. As a direct consequence of his actions, Scott Summers was imprisoned. That, however, did not mark the end of his influence, quite the opposite. Even behind bars, he emerged as a symbol of resistance and a revolutionary leader. Scott became even more proactive, organizing mutant rescues, protecting his people from persecution, and openly challenging a system that had always failed them. The outcome was inevitable. He became respected and followed, not only by young mutants who saw him as a savior, but also by historic figures within the mutant movement itself, including Magneto, who for the first time no longer saw Scott Summers as Xavier's student, but as an equal. Yes, the greatest mutant revolutionary in history ultimately became a follower of Scott Summers. That fact alone makes it clear that Cyclops' leadership ability is on par with any other character in Marvel, at least within the mutant world, where decisions aren't just about saving the day, but about ensuring the survival of an entire species. That turning point was absolutely fundamental to the character. Proved, once and for all, that Scott Summers does not rely on labels. Whether as a hero or a villain, Cyclops asserts himself as a force to be respected, feared, and taken seriously. Very few characters can carry that kind of narrative weight without losing coherence, and honestly, no other X-Man can make that claim with the same authority. Cyclops doesn't need to be the most powerful, the most charismatic, or the most popular. What defines him is his ability to lead in extreme scenarios, to make impossible decisions, and to own the consequences when everything goes wrong. And that is exactly what makes him unique within X-Men mythology. Now, there's hope that in the future we'll see more of this comic book Cyclops, the leader, the strategist, the cold and efficient commander, finally portrayed properly in movies and series. A Cyclops who stands alongside other X-Men as an equal, instead of having his importance constantly diminished or his spotlight taken away. Now tell me in the comments, what do you think of Cyclops today? Did you already know this entire journey? Or did this character surprise you?